January 17, 1945. The Ardennes, Belgium. The snow fell in silence. Not the gentle silence of a winter morning, but the heavy, oppressive silence that follows artillery fire, when the air itself seems stunned by violence, when even the wind holds its breath. Across the frozen fields west of St. Vith, the earth was torn open in blackened scars, steam rising from impact craters like the breath of some buried beast. The trees stood skeletal, their branches shattered into jagged splinters. And in that wounded landscape, beneath camouflage netting dusted white with frost, sat the angular silhouette of a German Panther tank, its long 75mm gun trained westward waiting. Inside the Panther's steel belly, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Reinhardt pressed his eye to the gunner's sight, his breath forming small clouds in the frozen air. The heating system had failed 2 days ago. His fingers, wrapped in strips of cloth torn from a dead man's coat, could barely feel the traverse wheel. But he did not need comfort. He needed only to see the Americans coming. And they would come. They always came. Wave after wave, like the sea against a cliff. And the cliff, Reinhardt believed, would hold. It always had. The Panther was more than a machine to men like Reinhardt. It was proof that German engineering could still turn the tide. Proof that one well-positioned tank, crewed by veterans who had survived Kursk and Normandy, could hold a road junction against a dozen enemy vehicles. The Panther's sloped armor could shrug off American 75mm shells like rain. Its gun could punch through a Sherman's frontal plate at 2,000 meters. Mathematics and metallurgy, Reinhardt thought, did not lie. And the mathematics said the Germans could still win this fight, one engagement at a time, grinding down the American advance through superior technology and veteran skill. What Reinhardt did not know, what none of the Panther crews dug into the frozen ridgeline could know, was that the Americans were no longer coming with just Shermans. They were bringing something else. Something that would make the mathematics irrelevant. To understand what happened in those snow-covered fields, one must first understand what the Panther represented. Not merely as a weapon, but as an article of faith. Since 1943, German tank crews had placed their lives in the hands of a doctrine that elevated quality over quantity, precision engineering over mass production. The Panther had been designed specifically to counter the Soviet T-34, born from the brutal lessons of Barbarossa, when German tankers discovered their Panzer IVs were outmatched. The result was a medium tank that weighed 45 tons, mounted a high-velocity 75mm KWK-42 gun with extraordinary penetration characteristics, and carried frontal armor sloped at 55 degrees, a glacis that could defeat most Allied anti-tank weapons at combat ranges. By the winter of 1945, Panthers had achieved an almost mythical status in German minds. They had torn through Sherman battalions in Normandy. They had destroyed entire Soviet tank brigades at Targul-Formos. Wehrmacht training manuals spoke of the Panther in terms approaching reverence. A single Panther, properly positioned with good fields of fire, could theoretically hold off a company of enemy armor. The 5-to-1 kill ratio achieved by Panther units on the Eastern Front seemed to validate this belief. Even Allied intelligence reports acknowledge the Panther as probably the finest balance of firepower, protection, and mobility fielded by any army in 1944. But doctrine born from past victories has a dangerous tendency to calcify into dogma, and dogma makes armies blind. The Americans had not been idle. While German industries struggled to produce 300 Panthers per month from factories ravaged by Allied bombing, American production lines turned out thousands of vehicles, not just tanks, but an entire ecosystem of armored warfare adapted to specific tactical problems. One of those solutions was the M4A3 105mm assault gun, a Sherman variant that replaced the standard 75mm gun with a 105mm howitzer. It sacrificed anti-armor capability for something else entirely, the ability to deliver high-explosive shells with devastating effect against fortified positions, infantry concentrations, and, crucially, dug-in armor exploiting defensive terrain. The German tankers waiting in their Panthers that January morning had never seen one in action. That ignorance would cost them everything. At 0620 hours, the American artillery began. Not the scattered harassment fire that usually preceded an attack, but methodical, coordinated bombardment that walked across the German positions with the precision of a surgeon's knife. White phosphorus rounds burst in the tree line, sending curtains of burning chemical rain across the camouflage positions. High explosive shells detonated in rhythmic sequence, each explosion calculated to suppress observation posts and anti-tank gun positions. The German defenders pressed themselves into their foxholes and fighting positions, waiting for barrage to lift, waiting for the familiar pattern. Artillery, then infantry, then the Shermans grinding forward into the kill zone, where German guns could methodically destroy them. But when the shelling stopped, what emerged from the morning fog was different. The 105mm assault guns came forward in a formation the Germans had not anticipated. They did not advance in the predictable line-abreast formation that made targets of standard Shermans. Instead, they moved in dispersed pairs, using terrain folds and smoke of the artillery barrage for concealment, advancing by bounds, one vehicle overmatching while its partner moved. They closed 800 meters before the first German gunner acquired a target. Reinhardt's Panther fired first. The 75mm gun cracked, and through his periscope he saw the tracer arc true, striking the lead assault gun squarely on its glassy plate. A perfect shot. At this range, against a standard Sherman, the tungsten cord round should have punched through the armor and ignited the ammunition. Instead, Reinhardt watched in disbelief as the assault gun shuddered from the impact, slewed slightly to the right, and kept moving. The round had struck, but failed to penetrate, glancing off the sloped armor at an angle that defeated even the Panther's formidable gun. Before Reinhardt could fire again, the assault gun stopped, traversed, and fired. What happened next was not tank versus tank combat, as the Germans understood it. The 105mm high-explosive shell did not attempt to penetrate the Panther's armor. It did not need to. The 17-pound warhead detonated against the Panther's side skirt with blast that was less a sound than a physical force, a concussion that rang the entire 45-ton vehicle like a gong. The explosion did not pierce the hull, but the overpressure wave transmitted through the armor, through the internal components, through the flesh and bone of the crew. Reinhardt felt his eardrums rupture. His vision went white. The impact shattered the gun sight, sent fragments of internal equipment flying like shrapnel. The radio operator slumped forward, blood running from his nose and ears. The driver screamed something Reinhardt could not hear, and the assault guns kept firing. They did not aim for killing shots. They aimed for shock. One 105mm round after another slammed into German positions, each explosion calculated for maximum psychological and physical effect. The Americans had done their mathematics too. Reinhardt realized dimly through the ringing in his head. They had calculated that a high-explosive shell delivered with precision against a fortified position did not need to destroy the armor. It only needed to destroy the men inside it or destroy their will to fight, which amounted to the same thing. A second Panther, commanded by Lieutenant Vogel, attempted to maneuver, backing out of its dug-in position to achieve a flanking angle. The assault guns fired in sequence, 3 rounds impacting within seconds. The first struck the engine deck, not penetrating but fragmenting against the ventilation grills, shredding the cooling system. The second hit the turret ring with force sufficient to jam the traverse mechanism. The third detonated directly beneath the hull as the Panther rolled over a shell crater, the blast lifting the right track clean off its road wheels. Vogel's crew abandoned their vehicle in blind panic, stumbling through the snow as machine gun fire from advancing American infantry kicked up frozen dirt around their boots. Within 7 minutes, 4 Panthers were disabled, not destroyed in the clean, catastrophic way of an ammunition fire or a penetrating hit to the fighting compartment, but systematically dismantled by a weapon system that turned their armor into a liability. The thick steel plates that should have protected them became conduction surfaces for blast waves. The enclosed fighting compartments became overpressure chambers. The narrow vision ports and periscopes shattered under repeated concussion. One by one, the Panthers fell silent, their crews deafened, bleeding, broken, or fled. The mathematical equation Reinhardt had believed in, the doctrine he had staked his life on, had been solved by the Americans in a way he had never imagined. They had not challenged German superiority in tank versus tank gunnery. They had simply made tank versus tank gunnery irrelevant. The after-action reports filed by the American commanders that day were notably dry in their language, as such documents always are. They noted that the 105mm assault guns of the 4th Armored Division had engaged enemy armor at ranges between 800 and 1,200 meters, expending an average of 4 rounds per target, achieving mobility kills or crew abandonment in 11 of 14 engagements. Friendly losses: 1 assault gun damaged by track failure, 0 combat casualties. The reports did not attempt to capture what the German survivors would later describe: the sensation of being inside a steel drum beaten by a giant hammer, the way blood vessels burst in their eyes from overpressure, the strange hallucinations that followed traumatic brain injury from repeated concussions. But some truths are recorded in numbers rather than words. Before the Ardennes offensive, the average kill-to-loss ratio for Panthers versus standard Sherman 75mm tanks was 3.6 to 1 in the Germans' favor. Against the 105mm assault guns in combined operations, that ratio inverted, 8 to 1 against the Panthers. The weapon that was supposed to ensure German tactical superiority had been systematically neutralized by American adaptation and industrial capacity to produce specialized variants for specific tactical problems. The 105mm assault gun was not, in absolute terms, a better tank than the Panther. In a direct engagement on open ground at long range, a Panther would likely still win. But the Americans were no longer fighting that battle. They had recognized that modern armored warfare was not a gladiatorial contest between individual vehicles, but a combined arms symphony in which each instrument played a specific role. The assault guns did not need to outduel Panthers. They only needed to suppress them long enough for infantry, tank destroyers, and tactical air support to exploit the gaps. They only needed to break the will of crews who had been promised invincibility and found themselves helpless against a weapon they could not effectively engage. This was a deeper shock that reverberated through the German defenders in those January days. Not merely tactical defeat, but conceptual disorientation. The Americans had changed the grammar of armored combat, and the Germans were still speaking an obsolete language. In the days that followed, as the German positions crumbled and the Wehrmacht pulled back toward the Rhine, stories began to circulate among the survivors. Stories told in field hospitals and aid stations, whispered in shattered villages during the long retreats. Oberfeldwebel Reinhardt, evacuated with ruptured eardrums and concussion, told anyone who would listen about the assault guns that came to the smoke like iron ghosts, immune to return fire, delivering shell after shell with machine-like precision. Other survivors spoke of the sound. Not the sharp crack of anti-tank guns, but the low, booming percussion of high-explosive shells that you felt in your chest before you heard them. They spoke of Panthers abandoned intact. Their crews, simply gone, fled into the woods because no amount of armor plate could protect against terror. These stories carried a subtext that the men themselves might not have fully articulated but felt in their bones. This was what American industrial power looked like when applied with tactical intelligence. Not the crude mass assaults they had expected, not the material waste they had been taught to disdain, but the systematic application of overwhelming resources directed by competent doctrine. The assault guns represented something deeper than a clever weapon. They represented an approach to war that the Wehrmacht, for all its tactical brilliance, could not match. An approach that began with accurate assessment of problems, continued through rapid industrial innovation, and concluded with mass production of specialized solutions. The Germans had designed the Panther to be the best medium tank in the world, and perhaps it was. But the Americans had designed an entire system of armored warfare in which best tank was a meaningless category. They had artillery that could fire from 20 kilometers away with accuracy to within 50 meters. They had forward observers with radios calling down fire within minutes. They had tactical air support that could arrive on station in a quarter hour. They had tank destroyers, assault guns, flamethrower tanks, mine-clearing tanks, bridge-laying tanks, a tool for every job, each one producing quantities that made losses irrelevant. And they had gasoline. Endless rivers of gasoline, flowing from tankers and jerry cans and improvised fuel dumps, while German tanks sat immobilized because the synthetic fuel plants had been bombed into rubble. The Panthers might be superior machines, but superior machines that could not move were just expensive steel coffins. Among the American crews manning the 105mm assault guns, there was a different kind of reckoning taking place. Corporal James Delaney, gunner on the lead assault gun that had taken Reinhardt's shot and kept advancing, later wrote in a letter home about the moment he realized they had survived a direct hit from a Panther. "We felt the impact, but the armor held," he wrote. "Jerry's best gun, and our Sherman just shook it off and kept rolling. I don't know what kind of math the engineers did when they angled that glassy plate, but it saved 5 American lives that morning." Delaney's letter, preserved in the National Archives among thousands of other soldiers' correspondence, touches on something the official histories sometimes miss: the psychological dimension of material superiority. The American crews knew they were not individually more skilled than their German counterparts. They knew the Panther was, on paper, a more capable vehicle than their modified Sherman. But they also knew that behind them were factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh, and Gary churning out vehicles faster than the Germans could destroy them. They knew that if their assault gun was disabled, another would be waiting. They knew that American industrial capacity had created a kind of immortality through replacement, not for individual men, perhaps, but for the units they served in, the divisions that would continue advancing no matter how many individual vehicles were lost. This was a psychological asymmetry that German tactical excellence could not overcome. A German tank crew knew that their Panther was irreplaceable, that the factories that built it were under constant bombardment, that spare parts were scarce, that every loss brought the final defeat incrementally closer. An American crew knew that behind them stretched a supply line that began in the factories of the arsenal of democracy and seemed to have no end. That knowledge changed how men fought. It made them bolder, more willing to accept tactical risks, more confident in pressing attacks, even when facing superior individual weapons. The 105mm assault guns were not just metal and mechanics. They were tangible proof that America could not merely match German innovation, but surpass it through systematic application of industrial strength and engineering creativity. Each shell they fired carried with it the implicit message: we have more of these. We can keep doing this. Can you? The story of the assault guns in the Ardennes might have remained an obscure tactical footnote, buried in after-action reports and unit histories, except for what happened when the German survivors began returning to their lines. They brought with them not just accounts of battlefield defeats, but something more insidious: the erosion of faith in German technical superiority. The Panther had been one of the last pillars supporting morale in the face of overwhelming Allied pressure. The myth that one German tank crew was worth 5 American crews, that German engineering excellence could compensate for numerical inferiority. These beliefs had sustained soldiers through the long retreats from Normandy and the catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front. The assault guns shattered that myth in a way that previous battles had not. When Panthers were destroyed by Allied fighter bombers, it could be attributed to air superiority, a temporary condition that might change. When they were knocked out by flanking shots from Shermans, it could be blamed on terrain or poor positioning. But when they were systematically disabled by a weapon they could not effectively engage, by a tactical system they had not anticipated, it forced a deeper recognition. The Americans were not winning through crude numerical advantage alone. They were winning because they had become technically proficient, tactically innovative, and industrially unstoppable. In the German military hospitals, psychiatrists began noting a new phenomenon among tank crews evacuated from the Ardennes. They exhibited symptoms consistent with severe concussion: the burst blood vessels, the hearing loss, the traumatic brain injuries from repeated overpressure exposure. But they also exhibited something else, a profound demoralization that the doctors struggled to classify. These were veteran soldiers, men who had survived Normandy and the Falaise Pocket, who had fought their way out of Stalin's cauldrons on the Eastern Front. But something in the Ardennes had broken them in a way previous defeats had not. The psychiatrist's notes, later captured by American intelligence officers, described crews who would flinch at sudden sounds, who refused to re-enter armored vehicles, who spoke obsessively about the booming percussion of the 105mm shells and the helpless feeling of sitting in armor that could not protect them. Modern analysis would recognize these symptoms as traumatic stress disorder. But in January 1945, German doctors simply noted unsuitable for further combat service and moved on to the next patient. The Wehrmacht did not have the luxury of long-term psychiatric care. It needed bodies to throw into the shrinking perimeter of the Reich. The tactical success of the assault guns prompted rapid changes in American armor doctrine. By February 1945, every armored division in Europe was requesting additional 105mm assault gun companies. The vehicles that had been considered specialized support weapons were being integrated into standard combined arms formations. Training manuals were hastily revised to emphasize the use of assault guns in suppressing enemy armor rather than attempting to engage in traditional tank duels. Forward observers were taught to call down assault gun fire against suspected Panther positions before committing standard Shermans to the advance. What the Americans had discovered, almost by accident, was a solution to one of the fundamental problems of armored warfare: how to advance against a technologically superior defensive force without sustaining prohibitive casualties. The answer was not to match the enemy tank for tank, but to systematically degrade his ability to fight through a combination of high explosive suppression, smoke artillery, and combined arms coordination. The assault gun was a linchpin of this system. The weapon that could close to effective range under cover of smoke and artillery, delivered devastating fire against fortified positions, and survived a return fire from enemy armor long enough to achieve tactical objectives. General George Patton, never a man given to quiet understatement, wrote in his diary after reviewing the after-action reports from the Ardennes, "The 105mm assault gun has proven itself worth its weight in gold. It is the sledgehammer that breaks the German defense. We could win this war with regular Shermans, but we'll win it faster with these." Coming from Patton, who had often criticized American tank designs as inadequate, this was notable praise. But the assault gun success also revealed something uncomfortable about American tactical evolution. For years, American tankers had been taught that they were inferior to German armor, that they needed to accept higher casualty rates, that victory would come through numbers and air superiority rather than tactical excellence. The assault gun success challenged that narrative. It suggested that when American industry and tactical innovation were properly aligned, American armor was not merely adequate, but potentially superior to German designs in the conditions that actually mattered, not in one-on-one duels on flat terrain, but in the complex, three-dimensional battlefields of Western Europe, where combined arms coordination and specialized tools determine outcomes. This realization came too late to fundamentally change American tank design. The war would be over before new models incorporating these lessons could be produced, but would profoundly influence post-war thinking about armored warfare. The assault gun concept would evolve into the self-propelled howitzers and infantry fighting vehicles of later decades. The lesson that armor need not be invulnerable, only adequate to accomplish specific tactical missions, would reshape how armies thought about vehicle design, and the recognition that overwhelming material superiority, when intelligently applied, could neutralize tactical excellence will become a cornerstone of American military doctrine for the next 70 years. For Klaus Reinhardt, the war ended in a hospital bed in Bavaria. His hearing permanently damaged, his nerves shattered, his faith in German victory extinguished. He would survive the war and live to see reunified Germany, would work as a machinist in a factory building automobiles instead of tanks. In his old age, when students of military history sought him out to discuss his experiences, he would tell them about the morning the assault guns came through the snow. He would describe the helpless feeling of sitting in the best medium tank in the world and being unable to fight back effectively. He would speak quietly about the moment he realized that German technical excellence, which he'd been taught to believe in since childhood, was not enough, could never be enough against an enemy who could produce 10 specialized solutions to every problem, while Germany struggled to produce one perfect weapon. "We thought we were fighting tanks," he said in one recorded interview from 1987. "But we were not fighting tanks. We were fighting an entire industrial system that could design, produce, and deploy whatever was needed to solve a tactical problem." The assault gun was not a better tank than the Panther, but it did not need to be. It needed only to make the Panther irrelevant, and it did. In those words lies a deeper truth about what happened in the fields outside St. Vith in January 1945. The Germans have been stunned not merely by a new weapon, but by a new way of war, a way that subordinated individual technical excellence to systematic application of industrial might. The Panthers had been built to win battles. The assault guns had been built to win the war. And in the calculus of total war between industrial superpowers, that distinction was everything. The snow continued to fall over the Ardennes long after the battles ended, covering the scarred earth, filling the shell craters, softening the harsh lines of abandoned vehicles. Nature, indifferent to human conflict, began the slow work of reclamation. But the lessons learned in those frozen fields would not be so easily covered over. They would echo through military academies and war colleges, through doctrinal debates and equipment acquisition programs, through the decades of Cold War confrontation that followed. The German veterans who survived would carry those lessons in their bodies. The damaged hearing, the headaches from old concussions, the involuntary flinch at sudden loud sounds. The American veterans would carry them differently, as a kind of pride tempered by knowledge of what industrial war demanded and delivered. Both sets of memories, German and American, would contribute to a collective understanding that modern warfare was no longer about the clash of individual warriors or even individual weapon systems, but about the collision of entire societies mobilized for organized violence. The 105mm assault gun itself would fade into obsolescence within a few years, replaced by more advanced designs, its specific tactical niche absorbed into multi-role vehicles. But what it represented, the ability of American industry to identify problems and engineer solutions faster than enemies could adapt, would become a defining characteristic of American military power. From the precision-guided munitions of Vietnam to the network-centric warfare of the Gulf, the fundamental lesson remained. American technical excellence lay not in building the perfect weapon, but in building adequate weapons in overwhelming quantities and adapting them rapidly to specific tactical challenges. There is a memorial stone now near St. Vith, erected by Belgian citizens to commemorate the fierce fighting of January 1945. It lists the divisions engaged, American and German, and notes the casualties on both sides. It does not mention the assault gun specifically. Such details are left to historians and technical specialists. But for those who know where to look in the surrounding fields, traces remain: rusted metal fragments half buried in farmers' fields, impact craters that still dimple the landscape in certain light, the foundations of German defensive positions slowly disappearing beneath decades of vegetation. These traces are the archaeology of a turning point, physical evidence of the moment when one kind of warfare gave way to another. The Panther represented the culmination of one tradition: individual technical excellence, careful positioning, the skilled duel between armored knights. The assault gun represented something newer and, in its way, more terrible: the industrial rationalization of violence. War is a problem of optimization and resource allocation, victory achieved not through superior skill, but through superior systems. Both traditions live on in modern military thought, in tension with each other, each representing different values and different visions of how war should be fought. But in the snow outside St. Vith in January 1945, there was no ambiguity about which approach would prevail. The mathematics had been calculated, the doctrine tested, the results recorded in after-action reports and casualty lists, and the testimony of men who had believed themselves invulnerable and learned otherwise. The Germans had been stunned, not by the assault gun itself, but by what it revealed: that the industrial democracy they had underestimated, that they had been taught to view as soft and decadent, could outthink them, out-engineer them, and ultimately overwhelm them through the systematic application of resources and intelligence. That recognition, spreading from crew to crew, unit to unit, was as devastating as any weapon. It was the beginning of the end, written in the smoking ruin of Panther positions and the thunder of 105mm guns. And in that thunder, if one listened carefully enough, one could hear the sound of the future, of wars fought not by heroes in single combat, but by nations transformed into machines of organized violence, of conflicts decided by industrial capacity and technical flexibility rather than battlefield courage. It was a future that neither German nor American soldiers had particularly wanted, but it was a future they had made, shell by shell, position by position, in the frozen fields of Belgium as winter gripped the dying Reich. The snow fell, the guns fell silent, and the old way of war, the way of knights in steel armor trusting to superior machines and veteran skill, passed into history, its final epitaph written in the blast craters where Panthers had stood and could stand no longer.